Helen hadn't always felt invisible. There were years, decades even, when her presence commanded attention. As a loving mother, a devoted wife, and a respected teacher. But now, at 54, with her children grown and her marriage dissolved, life had become a series of routines. Mornings were for coffee and crossword puzzles. Afternoons stretched into aimless errands. And evenings? Quiet, save for the hum of a television she barely watched. The grocery store was part of her ritual, a place where she could wander aimlessly without feeling out of place. It was here, among the neatly stocked shelves of canned goods and fresh produce, that Helen first noticed him. He stood in the baking aisle, holding 2 jars of honey, his brow furrowed as though the choice between clover and wildflower carried the weight of the world. She couldn't help but smile at his intensity. He looked no older than 30, tall with sandy brown hair that curled slightly at the ends. "You'd think one of them was poison," Helen quipped as she reached for a bag of flour nearby. He glanced up, startled, then chuckled. "Right. I mean, who knew honey could be so complicated?" There was an ease to his smile that caught her off guard, a warmth that felt like sunlight breaking through a cloudy sky. "Well, if it helps," she said, pointing to the wildflower jar, "this one makes great tea." "Sold," he replied, placing the jar in his basket. "Thanks for the expert advice." She laughed softly, a sound she hadn't heard from herself in longer than she could remember. Anytime. As she turned to leave, she felt his eyes linger, not in a way that was uncomfortable, but curious, as if he was trying to figure her out. For reasons she couldn't quite understand, Helen found herself lingering too. By the time she reached the checkout line, she thought the moment had passed. But there he was again, 2 lanes over, fumbling with his wallet. Their eyes met briefly, and he smiled again, that same warm, effortless grin. It was a fleeting interaction, one that should have faded into the monotony of her day. Yet, as she drove home with bags of groceries stacked in the back seat, Helen realized she couldn't stop thinking about the stranger in the baking aisle. For the first time in years, her routine had been disrupted, not by obligation or necessity, but by someone unexpected. And for the first time in years, Helen felt the faint flicker of something she thought long extinguished. Possibility. Helen didn't expect to see him again. The grocery store was a place of anonymity, where faces blurred together in a sea of errands and to-do lists. Yet a week later, there he was, standing in front of the fruit display, holding a pineapple as if it were a puzzle he needed to solve. This time, she approached him deliberately, her heart doing a strange little flutter she hadn't felt since her 20s. "Don't tell me, pineapple selection is as complicated as honey." He turned, recognition lighting up his face. "You'd be surprised. Apparently, you can tell if it's ripe by pulling on the leaves, but I think they just fall off to mess with me." Helen laughed, feeling an ease she hadn't felt with anyone in years. "I stick to the pre-cut ones. Less drama." He chuckled and set the pineapple down. "I might have to follow your lead. I'm no match for tropical fruit." Their conversation flowed easily from there. She learned his name was Ethan, and he was new to town, having moved recently for work. He was an artist, specializing in painting and murals, which explained the paint smudges on his hands that he didn't seem to notice. "What about you?" he asked, leaning casually against the cart. "What keeps you busy?" Helen hesitated. What did keep her busy? The days blurred together in a routine so familiar it was almost invisible. "I'm retired," she said finally. "Used to be a teacher. Now I mostly read, bake, and, well, grocery shop." "Sounds like a pretty sweet life," he said, his tone sincere. She smiled, surprised by how much his words mattered. "It has its moments." Their conversation stretched longer than either of them likely intended, moving from pineapples to books, and then to art. Ethan spoke with a passion that was contagious, his hands gesturing wildly as he described a mural he was working on downtown. "You should see it," he said suddenly. "It's still a work in progress, but I'd love to know what you think." Helen hesitated. The idea of stepping into his world felt bold, almost reckless, but she found herself nodding. "I'd like that." They exchanged numbers, and as she walked out of the store, Helen felt a new energy coursing through her. Ethan had started as a fleeting interaction, a momentary disruption in her routine. Now he was something more, a spark of light breaking through her otherwise predictable days. For the first time in years, Helen found herself looking forward to something and someone new. Helen stood in front of the bathroom mirror, studying her reflection. She had made an effort for the first time in what felt like ages. Soft curls framed her face, and a swipe of her favorite lipstick added a hint of color. It wasn't much, but it was enough to remind her of the woman she used to be. Ethan had invited her to see the mural that afternoon. The thought of meeting him outside the grocery store sent a thrill through her, though she told herself it was nothing more than curiosity. As she approached the construction site downtown, she spotted him instantly. Ethan was perched on a ladder, a brush in hand, painting a vibrant splash of orange across a towering canvas of blues and greens. His focus was intense, and she couldn't help but admire the way he poured himself into his work. "Hey, Helen," he called down, noticing her. He climbed down with an easy grace and flashed her a grin. "Glad you came. I wouldn't miss it," she said, her voice lighter than usual. Ethan gave her a tour of the mural, explaining each section with enthusiasm. The piece depicted an abstract journey, vivid shapes and colors weaving together to tell a story of transformation and hope. "It's beautiful," Helen said, genuinely moved. He beamed. "It's still rough around the edges, but I think it's getting there. What do you see in it?" Helen hesitated, then said, "It feels like change. Like stepping out of something old and into something new. Even if it's scary." Ethan looked at her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "That's exactly what I was going for." They spent the afternoon talking by the mural, their conversation meandering from art to life and back again. Ethan's stories were filled with color and spontaneity, a stark contrast to the quiet, steady life Helen had built for herself. At one point, he reached out and brushed a speck of paint from her cheek. The gesture was casual, almost innocent, but it sent a warmth through her that lingered long after. That evening, Helen sat on her porch, replaying their time together. For the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge the feelings stirring within her. It wasn't just admiration or friendship. It was something deeper, something she hadn't felt in decades. But with that realization came a flood of doubt. He was young, vibrant, and full of possibility. She was older, set in her ways, with a lifetime of memories etched into her skin. "What are you doing, Helen?" she murmured to herself. The logical part of her mind warned against the foolishness of it all. Yet, her heart whispered something different, that maybe, just maybe, she deserved to feel this alive again. The days following Helen's visit to the mural were a storm of emotions. Each time she thought of Ethan, his easy laughter, the way he looked at her when she spoke, her chest tightened with an unfamiliar ache. She had spent so long convincing herself that love, or even the possibility of it, was a thing of the past. She wasn't looking for it, and yet here it was, sneaking into her quiet, orderly life and appending everything. Sitting at the kitchen table, Helen sipped her tea, her mind a tangle of hope and fear. What could someone like Ethan possibly see in her? Surely, their connection was just a kind gesture on his part, a young man indulging an older woman in friendly conversation. But the way he made her feel couldn't be denied. He had brought color back to a life that had faded to shades of gray. For years, her days had been a series of routines. Work, errands, evenings alone. Ethan, with his boundless energy and curiosity, had made her laugh, think, and feel in ways she hadn't allowed herself to in years. And yet, the doubts were relentless. She thought of her late husband, Richard, whose memory still lingered in the house. They had built a good life together, but even before his passing, their love had settled into something predictable and quiet. Was it disloyal to feel this way now? Then there was the looming shadow of judgment. What would her friends say if they knew she had even entertained the idea of having feelings for someone so much younger? What would her own children think? The next time she saw Ethan at the grocery store, he greeted her with the same warmth that had drawn her to him in the first place. "Hey, Helen," he said, his smile lighting up the aisle. "I was hoping I'd see you. You free for coffee sometime?" Helen hesitated, her heart pounding. That sounds nice." As they sat in the small cafe down the street, the conversation flowed effortlessly. He asked her about her life, genuinely interested in the story she had to tell. He talked about his plans, his dreams, his struggles. At one point, Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "You know, you've got this way of seeing things that's different. Like you notice stuff other people don't. Helen's cheeks warmed. I suppose age has its perks, she said lightly, though her voice wavered. He chuckled. Maybe. But it's more than that. The sincerity in his voice stirred something deep within her, a mix of joy and fear. As they parted ways that afternoon, Ethan gave her a quick hug, a simple, friendly gesture, but one that lingered long after. Helen returned home and stood by the mirror, studying her reflection again. For the first time, she saw not just the lines of age, but also the possibility of a new chapter. But could she truly let herself believe it? Or would she let fear and doubt keep her from embracing the spark that had reignited in her heart? Helen spent the next few days in a whirlwind of thoughts, replaying her coffee with Ethan. His words, his smile, the way he looked at her like she was someone worth knowing, it all stayed with her, weaving through her mind as she went about her routine. For the first time in years, the solitude of her home felt heavier. The room seemed too quiet, the evenings too long. She had been content in her bubble of independence, but now it felt like a shield, a defense she no longer wanted to carry. One evening, as she prepared dinner, an idea took shape. The thought of inviting Ethan to her home made her pulse race with a mix of excitement and dread. What if he said no? Or worse, what if he said yes, and the reality of her world, the quiet life she led, fell flat in comparison to his energy and vitality? Yet, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was her moment to step out of her comfort zone. The next time they met at the grocery store, she took a deep breath and said, Ethan, I've been meaning to thank you for keeping me company at the cafe the other day. It was nice. Nice, he teased, raising an eyebrow. I was hoping for unforgettable. Helen laughed, shaking her head. Well, unforgettable then. Anyway, I was wondering if you'd like to come over for dinner sometime. Nothing fancy, just me trying to repay the kindness. Ethan's grin was immediate and warm. I'd love that. When were you thinking? Tomorrow evening, she offered, trying to keep her voice steady. Perfect. What should I bring? Just yourself, she said, her heart fluttering. That night, Helen scoured her recipe books, settling on a simple yet elegant menu. She wanted the evening to feel special without overthinking it. As she cooked, she found herself humming, a habit she hadn't realized she'd abandoned years ago. When the doorbell rang the next evening, Helen took a steadying breath before opening it. Ethan stood there, holding a bottle of wine and a bouquet of daisies. These felt like you, he said, handing her the flowers. Helen blinked back a sudden wave of emotion. Thank you, Ethan. They're lovely. As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed as easily as ever. They spoke of books, movies, and dreams, both fulfilled and unspoken. At one point, Ethan paused, his gaze settling on her. You know, Helen, I don't think I've ever met anyone like you. You've got this way of making the ordinary seem extraordinary. Her breath caught at the sincerity in his voice. She wanted to deflect, to make a joke, but something in his expression told her not to. Thank you, she said softly, her voice laced with vulnerability. They lingered over dinner, the hours slipping by unnoticed. By the time Ethan left, the house no longer felt empty. As Helen tidied up, she realized she had taken a step she never thought she would. A step toward connection, possibility, and maybe even love. The days following Ethan's visit felt different, alive in a way she hadn't experienced in years. Helen couldn't stop thinking about the evening they'd shared. His laughter still echoed in her mind, his touch lingering on her skin when he helped clear the table. There was a tenderness in his gestures that left her feeling both seen and cherished. She woke up one morning to the sound of birds outside her window and realized, with a surprising clarity, that for the first time in what felt like forever, she was looking forward to something. Her life had become so predictable, and yet Ethan had cracked open a door she hadn't even known was there. That week, they continued to see each other at the cafe, their conversations deepening with each passing meeting. They talked about everything. Their favorite books, the things they had lost, and the things they were still searching for. Ethan shared his dreams of traveling the world, while Helen spoke of her long-buried wish to learn how to paint. It was in those simple moments, as they exchanged stories and laughed at shared jokes, that the foundation of something more was being built. She had never imagined that such a connection could come from something so unassuming, a random encounter in a grocery store. One afternoon, as they sat together in the quiet cafe, their hands brushed across the table. The warmth of his touch lingered, a spark that traveled up her arm and settled somewhere deeper in her chest. Helen felt a flutter of something she hadn't felt in years. Ethan looked at her, his gaze steady and filled with something she couldn't quite place. "Helen," he said softly, his voice like velvet, "I don't know what it is about you, but I feel like I can talk to you about anything. I can't remember the last time I felt this comfortable with someone." Helen's heart skipped a beat. She swallowed, not sure if she should respond, but she knew she couldn't keep pretending that this wasn't something more than friendship. "I feel the same," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been alone for a long time. But with you it's different." His hand, resting on the table, moved slightly closer to hers. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the air thick with unspoken words and the weight of what was shifting between them. Helen was aware of the warmth of his hand so close to hers, the electric pull of a connection that had blossomed without warning. Then Ethan smiled, that soft, knowing smile that seemed to reach into her soul. "I think we're both in uncharted waters here." Helen chuckled, but the fluttering in her chest wouldn't subside. It was the first time in years she had felt truly seen. Not as a woman of a certain age, not as someone's mother or a quiet neighbor, but as herself, Helen. And for the first time in so long, she realized that maybe she wasn't just yearning for companionship. Maybe she was yearning for something more. As they parted ways that day, Ethan kissed her cheek, a gesture so simple and tender that it almost took her breath away. "See you tomorrow," he said, his voice low, filled with promise. Helen stood there for a moment after he left, her hand resting on her cheek where his lips had been. She realized that the most unexpected part of all this wasn't the age difference, or even the fact that they had become something more than friends. It was how completely she had allowed herself to feel again. The days that followed were both a blur and a slow unraveling of old fears. Helen found herself waking each morning with a sense of anticipation, her heart stirring in a way it hadn't in years. Ethan's visits had become the highlight of her days, his presence a balm for the solitude that had once defined her. But with that warmth came an undercurrent of anxiety, a quiet battle between what she felt and what she feared. There was no denying the joy she felt when he was near. His laughter, his touch, the way his eyes lit up when he spoke to her. It was all so new, so unfamiliar. She hadn't realized how long it had been since she had been touched with such tenderness, how long it had been since someone made her feel seen not just for her history, but for who she was right now in this moment. But every time she allowed herself to lean into the feeling, doubt crept in. The age gap, so apparent when she stopped to think about it, loomed over her like a shadow. Helen was no fool. She knew what others might say if they knew about her and Ethan. She could already hear the whispers, the judgment. Too old for him, they would say. What could she possibly offer someone so young? The weight of societal expectations felt heavy on her shoulders. She tried to push these thoughts aside, to let herself simply enjoy the time she spent with him, but they lingered, like an ever-present fog. What if he only saw her as a passing fling? What if this was just some fleeting attraction, something he would grow bored of as quickly as it had begun? And what about his life, his future? He was just starting out, filled with dreams and possibilities, while she was closer to the end of her journey than the beginning. How could someone like him possibly want to stay? And yet, when she looked into his eyes, none of that mattered. His affection for her was real, she could feel it. But Helen couldn't help but wonder if it was only a matter of time before the reality of their differences would push them apart. One evening, after a particularly long conversation over dinner, as the last remnants of dessert were being cleared from the table, Ethan reached across and took her hand. His touch was light, gentle, but there was an urgency to it, like he wanted to anchor them both in this moment. "Helen," he said, his voice uncharacteristically serious, "I know you're worried about something, and I want you to know this, whatever this is between us, it's real to me. I don't care about the age difference. I care about you." Helen's breath caught in her throat. Her heart pounded, and for a moment, she couldn't find her voice. "I'm not sure how this fits into my life," she said, her voice trembling despite her best efforts to remain composed. "I've spent so many years alone, and now you've come into my life so suddenly. And I don't want to be a complication for you." Ethan's thumb gently brushed the back of her hand. "Helen," he repeated softly, "you're not a complication. You're everything I didn't know I needed." I don't care about what anyone else thinks. I care about being with you. Right here. Right now. Helen closed her eyes, the words washing over her. The doubts, the fears, they were still there, lurking in the corners of her mind, but they didn't seem as loud as they had before. In this moment, with Ethan's hand in hers and the warmth of his gaze on her, the only thing that mattered was the way he made her feel, alive, cherished, and seen. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. She took a deep breath and squeezed his hand. I'm scared, she admitted, her voice small but resolute. But maybe we can try. Together. Ethan's face softened, and he pulled her gently into a hug, the kind of embrace that said everything words could not. In that moment, Helen realized that love wasn't about age, about time. It was about the willingness to step into the unknown, to be vulnerable, to trust. And for the first time in a long while, she was ready to take that step. The days after that conversation passed in a kind of haze, slow, tender, and full of small moments that Helen had never allowed herself to fully embrace before. The weight she had carried for so long, the quiet burdens of doubt and fear, began to lift in the presence of Ethan. They shared laughter over trivial things, shopping together, cooking meals, even sitting in comfortable silence while reading. With him, everything felt more vivid, more alive. Ethan had a way of seeing her that she had longed for but never truly believed she would have again. He admired her, not just for her experiences or the wisdom that came with age, but for the person she was now. He made her feel like the most important thing in the room. And for once, Helen didn't shrink away from it. She let herself be seen. They often talked about the future, about their dreams. She had once thought those conversations were only for the young, the ones with the world ahead of them, but with Ethan, they felt natural. He wanted to build something with her, even if it wasn't clear what that would look like. And Helen, despite her fears, found herself imagining a future where age was simply a number, where love was simply love. One afternoon, as they sat on the balcony overlooking the city, the warm glow of the setting sun enveloping them, Helen found herself reflecting on everything she had learned in these past months. What did I miss? She wondered aloud, her voice soft, yet confident. All these years, I thought I was done. I thought love had passed me by. But I was wrong. Ethan smiled, his hand reaching for hers, his touch grounding her. Love doesn't have an expiration date, Helen. It doesn't stop because we get older. It just changes. And sometimes it's more beautiful because of the time we've lived. Helen looked out at the horizon, a small smile playing on her lips. She had spent so much time thinking about what she had lost in her life, but now, she was finally learning how to look at what she had gained. Love wasn't perfect, nor was it easy, but it was real, and it was hers to nurture, regardless of the judgments others might make. They had found something beautiful, something rare in the simplicity of their connection, and it was worth every moment of uncertainty to hold on to it. I'm not afraid anymore, she whispered, squeezing Ethan's hand tightly. No, he replied, and neither am I. Together they stood, hands clasped, hearts open, ready to embrace whatever the future would bring. Because they knew, no matter the challenges they faced, their love would be worth it. It always would be. And for the first time in years, Helen felt that, perhaps, there was still so much ahead of her, more to discover, more to love. At any stage in life, love could surprise you, could heal you, and could make you believe in the possibility of joy, no matter how long you've waited. She smiled to herself, feeling the weight of her past no longer as something that defined her, but as something that had prepared her for this, the love that would last, the love she deserved.